So first of all, let me just quickly go through the bios of these. I mean, sometimes when you read other people's bios, it does make you wonder what you've been doing with your life so far. But there we go. Carole Mundell, Professor Carole Mundell, was appointed Chief Science Advisor at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in October 2018. She's Professor of Extragalactic Astronomy, Head of Astrophysics at the University of Bath, and a Fellow of the Institute of Physics. She studied at the University of Glasgow, where she gained a BSc in Physics, before working at the Jodrell Bank University, University of Manchester, where she completed a PhD in astrophysics. She later moved to the University of Maryland before joining Liverpool John Moores University, where she received her first professorship in 2007. Carole is a world-leading scientist, a frequent guest speaker at international conferences, and sits on a number of strategic advisory panels for UK and international groups, and is a committed science communicator as well as an advocator for diversity in science. Now, Professor Juliet Gerrard trained at Oxford University and moved to Aotearoa, New Zealand in 1993, where her career has included roles in both Crown Research Institutes and universities. Her research background is broad and interdisciplinary, with particular interests in fundamental and applied protein science. She has held an industry and outreach fellowship with the Callaghan Innovation, founded a startup company, chaired the Marsden Council, and served on the board of directors of plant and food research. Now, since Juliet's appointment in 2018 as Prime Minister Ardern's Chief Science Advisor, Kaita Hutu Mātanga Putaia Mātua Kita Piramia, she has worked from a base of 4 founding principles, which are rigor, inclusivity, transparency, and accessibility. She supported the science and science advisor community to provide advice to the Prime Minister, ministers, and the public on a wide range of topics, including advice on the Christchurch mosque shootings, the Whakaari White Island eruption, and of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. In 2019, her office released a major report, Rethinking Plastics in Aotearoa, New Zealand, which created a vision for a new relationship with plastic. So that's my very quick canter through. These are the 2 women that we have talking with us today. And I wanted to start, you know, it's nice to have 2 women on the panel. And so I wanted to start really with a bit of a topic on diversity in science, because science and the STEM subjects are generally an area where it has been largely the preserve of white men, and there's been a big effort to try and right that balance. So I wonder if I can come to you first, Carole, to talk about your efforts to get more women into science.
Thank you, Laura. It's a great pleasure to be here enjoying this exciting conversation. Yeah, so I'm a physicist by background, and as you say, the archetype for physics is the older white man, the Einstein figure, often the white male genius who will go on to get a Nobel Prize. And I think that stereotype's quite unhelpful. So throughout my career, I mean, I've had some wonderful male mentors, very few women role models. And I think when I look ahead of me and think about the very single women who were trailblazers, the likes of Professor Dame Jocelyn Bell Burnell, and thinking about how lonely that position must have been. And I realised that, you know, it's really important that we open up the pathways. And if you don't see someone who's like you, it's very difficult to imagine yourself in that role. And so I did, you know, have really good opportunities throughout my early research career. And it's actually as I've become more senior that I've started to see many of those barriers much more clearly, and worked to really, you know, figure out how to remove them. And I think there are a few key pillars there. First of all, actually being authentic myself. So actually, you know, being an active scientist, and it's a great privilege to work in the Foreign Office and be able to project that job role internationally. And then I think actually working on the structures and the systems. So I've done that both in a personal capacity, you know, supporting young women, particularly through some very difficult times, you know, some major failures of organisational culture, for example, around sexual harassment. And then also more structurally, when I became head of the physics department, looking at some of the hidden biases and the hidden barriers, and making an opportunity for people to come, men and women, because obviously when you look at minorities in any background, and I think of them as sort of the canary in the mine. If you have a monoculture, that's actually bad for everybody. I mean, it's much better to have a wider diversity. And then really looking to see what was some of the subconscious biases that we had to deal with, some of the transformations in terms of systems and promotions, and also boosting young women's confidence and saying, actually, you can do this, you should be here, and how we, for example, phrase a job advert. There are now really nifty online tools where you can put the text of a job advert in and it will tell you whether your advert is gendered in either direction, for example, and you can then nuance that and make sure that you're balancing that in a way that's right for your recruitment. And then I think also working with learned societies. So the Institute of Physics has been doing lots of work on gender for many years, and we've seen at undergraduate recruitment something like 20% of our undergraduate intake have been girls stubbornly for 20 years. And so recently the Institute of Physics started to do a piece of research to look really in the school system and working with parents and teachers to understand what is the blockage, because children are equally excited about the world, want to understand how things work from a young age. So what is it that switches girls off in particular in our systems? And they've now brought in a really nice initiative to work with schools to tackle whole school gender stereotypes, which means that you don't just single out physics, but you actually tackle all of that and open up the opportunities for girls to choose to do what they want to do, rather than have these subconscious stereotypes that limit their choices. And then more broadly, working with, for example, the Women in Science and Engineering. I'm an ambassador for the WISE campaign. That's a Princess Royal, Princess Anne, is our patron. And she's very, very clear when she challenges us back, because she asked me very, very simply, why aren't there more women in physics? What are you doing about it? And I think that clarity of thought, yes, why aren't there actually? Let's not assume that this is a natural state of play. And I think, just to finish, there's such a big range of global challenges that we have to tackle, from climate change, never mind, the pandemic that we're looking at the moment. Astrophysics is a good example of one of those big subjects, big questions that we can use as a vehicle to do computer science, physics, maths, all the things that stereotypically are not what girls do. We don't have to talk about those siloed traditional subjects anymore. We can talk about the big questions and say, come and work on something practical or something really big and imaginative, and you'll do all the maths, physics and computing and engineering as you go along, but they're a tool and a means to an end to do something bigger. So I think lots of exciting opportunities, and it's great to connect, with yourself and with Juliet, because I think doing that internationally is really, really important. We shouldn't be doing that just on a national basis.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. And it matters so much, doesn't it? Because even though you could, some people might say, well, it's just about preference. And there's very much a culture of, well, girls go into the arts and boys go into the science. But if you think about how critical these subjects are for what sort of society we're going to have now and going forward in the future, you have to have that diversity there. Otherwise, you're going to end up thinking about development of AI, for example. You're going to end up with viewed in a certain direction, which is not helpful.
Absolutely. If I could just say quickly, on the side of choice, and this is again a bit of a stereotype, there's a campaign in the UK called Let Toys Be Toys, and they've done a lot of analysis about where this belief system that girls are naturally more caring and sensitive and will go into the caring professions and the arts and humanities, and boys are more practical and engineering based. And actually that again is a stereotype. It's wrong. Boys are sensitive and caring, and girls are practical and agentive. And actually it goes right down to the very youngest stereotypes in the way we portray our toys as boys toys and girls toys. So very, very fundamental in how we structure our society.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Carole. And Juliet, you've done a huge amount of work in your role as Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor in trying to incorporate Mātauranga Māori, so Māori knowledge and science and belief systems, and also to make sure that science work in Aotearoa New Zealand really reflects Aotearoa New Zealand, both in terms of sort of Māori participation, Pacifica and others. So can you talk to us a bit more about that work?
Kia ora, Laura, and thank you for organising this panel. It's great to connect with Carole again, having managed to meet her in real life just after taking up this role before all our borders shut. So it's lovely to have the opportunity. When I came into the role, I think everyone assumed that women in STEM would be an obvious banner for me to carry, and of course I do. But just reflecting on Carole's words earlier, that you can't be what you can't see, mantra is something that people are increasingly accepting. And if you look at the screen now, here we are, and we're all white. So in New Zealand in particular, with Māori participation, it's not just about equity and diversity and inclusion, it's also about the treaty. And so I've been on a real journey in this role, learning more about what our treaty obligations mean in terms of these sorts of equity issues, and that overlay gives the thinking a really sharp focus. And as well as creating an inclusive environment and making our institutions a safer and more productive place for other demographics, I think really trying to learn about the Indigenous ways of thinking has added an extra layer to how we should think about evidence and solving problems. So I'm not an expert in Mātauranga Māori by any stretch, but I've spent some time with lots of Māori researchers really trying to unpack what that knowledge framework means. And I think actually there's lots of tools in there that Western science would naturally reject, but could look at more productively, in the fact that Indigenous thinking and Mātauranga Māori in particular are very holistic, very focused on the systems. So I sit here as someone who trained in Oxford as a chemist, which is probably about as reductionist as you can get in a training, whereas the Māori way of knowing would also overlap with the way of doing, and think about the whole system, what knowledge means, what the interface of knowledge and action means. And lots of the tools that we're really struggling with in terms of getting community engagement, getting communities to own a problem before we solve it, fit very naturally into the kaupapa Māori way of doing things. So I think there's huge strengths in those knowledge frameworks and those communities. And if we adopt them, it's not just an EDI inclusivity piece, it's also a how can we use other tools and other ways of knowing to solve some of the big problems. So the Minister for Research, Science and Innovation in New Zealand, Megan Woods, was very supportive of this work. And one of the things we did was help facilitate a series of hui or meetings with, I think it started with 170 Māori researchers. And that group had a very open discussion. It was Māori only to start with. I joined halfway through the second one, I think, and slowly pulled out some what works, some strength-based programs, really understood what was out there in New Zealand, Aotearoa, and was working to persuade Māori kids around age 13 in particular that science was a place for them, and that Indigenous way of knowing was a good fit with that thinking. It ended up with the third hui with a small group of 10 showcasing some of the programs that really worked, and the minister sat down with those people for an hour and really unpicked what was working, why it was working, and how we could do more of it to really make science in New Zealand a more inclusive place. Early days, the numbers are really not impressive, so I think we're at 2 or 3% Māori Pacifica in our science workforce compared to, depending on how you count, 15-25% of the population. But at least we've taken some paths on that journey, and some of the Māori researchers put together a great Vision Mātauranga document to just showcase the strengths and really explain in a kind of how-to way how you might start to embrace that knowledge.
Yeah. And that's fascinating. Thank you. Because I think that so often, we talk about unconscious, we're all aware of unconscious bias, but it sort of fits everywhere. But unless we sort of really focus with the fact that our science tradition is really that Western science tradition, and we need to keep stopping and looking and saying, well, actually, that's not the only perspective, and try and make sure it is representative and drawing on those strengths. So thank you for that, Juliet. And we've done quite a bit of work as the British High Commission in this space of Mātauranga Māori. We had a project called He Whai Mātauranga, so In Pursuit of Knowledge, which was all about increasing the connections between iwi Māori, so tribes of New Zealand, and New Zealand cultural institutions with cultural institutions in the UK who host lots of Māori taonga or cultural artifacts. And that was all about building those relationships, building the research connections, and so that various Māori academics and students could go over and study those taonga and really unpack the knowledge that are held in them about the history of Aotearoa, and then bring it back. And that is, that's just been a sort of project to really increase those connections, but we're hoping it grows into something even more exciting, because it's a really, really interesting area and really does make you stop to think about things differently. So thank you, Kia ora, Juliet. I want to move on to the sort of big 2020 topic shortly, but I just wanted to say to everyone who's gathered in our audience that you should be sending questions through chats, and we will moderate those at the end. And the other thing I wanted to say is we're going to aim to wrap up at 5 to 9 or 5 to 8 sharp, because our professors have other appointments. So just to let you know about that. But I'm going to, and I've just had a couple of questions come through, but I will probably sort of bring all of those together at the end, and we'll just keep going with this conversation. So now, of course, the big thing this year has been COVID for all of us, and been kind of all-consuming in lots of ways. And New Zealand has received lots of plaudits, deservedly, for how it has managed COVID and pursued an elimination strategy. So I wonder, Juliet, if you can talk to us a bit about the role that you have played in New Zealand's COVID management strategy, but then also about the communications side of it, because of course a pandemic is it's a health crisis, but it's also of course a comms crisis, because what you're trying to do is get your populations to behave in the way that will manage the risk as well as possible. So I wonder if I can go to you first, Juliet.
Sure. So I guess the first thing to say is that in many ways my role is a spare part in these sorts of situations. So all the official advice to government goes through the Director General of Health, who the Kiwis on the line will know did an amazing job at communicating the strategy alongside the PM, making sure that the advice was really clear at all times. My role is to come in from the side, and especially to connect internationally, see what's happening offshore, keep up to date with the science, and just act as a conduit of alerts from researchers to government. And in a situation like COVID, when the data and the evidence is changing so quickly, it becomes a much more important role than it would for your day-to-day public health crisis. So especially at the beginning, when the evidence was changing rapidly, I spent a lot of time connecting, including internationally, and was really pleased to have built those relationships with the CSA network in the UK in particular. Carole's part of a network which is parallel to the one that we have in New Zealand of all the different chief science advisors. And my counterpart, Sir Patrick Vallance, has a fantastic science advice to government and emergencies team that we're in the process of learning from, actually, when COVID struck. We had the advantage of time, so it's just pure luck that the virus went to other places first. And happily in New Zealand, we were smart enough to use that time and really look around the world to see what was working, what wasn't working, and advise the government accordingly to pivot very rapidly from a plan that was quite similar to the one that was in the UK, actually, to one that looked more like Taiwan and Hong Kong and the places where you could see it was working. And as you said, Laura, nothing would have worked without communication. So both science communication and communication more generally. We had a group of absolutely stellar science communicators. Susie Wiles is top of mind with those at the moment. She's a UK-born person also, and I think she's just been named on the BBC Top 100 Women. So it was nice to see her there. And she collaborated with a cartoonist, Toby Morris, and really put out some clear graphics and appealed to people that maybe weren't listening to some of the other science communicators who did fit that more traditional mold. So we had a whole group of people that were out there explaining the evidence, explaining why and how the evidence was changing and what that meant, just treating people as grown-ups and explaining why it was that we were staying inside, why it was that we were washing our hands, why it was that we used soap, because that actually kills the virus. And connecting very carefully with the government communication strategy. So bits of the science were connected in. But those international connections and communication tools were absolutely vital. So it was fantastic to have the links to the UK and all around the world and catch up with the chief science advisors once a week at its peak, just to make sure that none of us were missing anything.
Thank you. And I suppose that one of the great mediums for this comms, of course, has been social media, and Susie and Toby Morris, lots of their work was on social media, and that's been a really good way of getting messages out. Of course, the dark side to that is all the disinformation that you can get as well around the pandemic, and also, of course, around vaccine misinformation. And Carole, you've been the UK has been doing quite a lot of work on the misinformation side. So can you talk about that?
That's right, Laura, and I'm really interested to hear Juliet's comments about sort of the Maori science system and having communities own a problem before you try to solve it. And of course, the speed with which the pandemic hit, that was a learning curve for us as well. And again, you know, hats off to the New Zealand team for their visual comms, which I think is a really powerful way to help people internalise complex information in a simple way. And so really looking at how communities build their trust in government or trust their government in terms of the science advice that's given. So yeah, I think there's misinformation, so people misunderstand, or who do they get their information from? Is that from their local communities? Is it a faith leader? Is it a relative? Is it the TV? Or is it online? Is it social media? And then who do they follow? We all know if we're on social media, we're in a bubble of our own anyway. We don't often step outside of those bubbles of people who follow us and who we follow. So I think there's misinformation, and what we've found in the UK is that the trust in scientists, when we do these surveys, is high. And so that we know when we have an authentic voice in the media, so the mainstream media, giving a clear explanation, as Juliet said, treating people as grown-ups and explaining the mechanisms by which the virus transmits, for example, and measures to take to protect yourself. That's a very powerful way to connect with people. What we found with some of the work we did on SAGE was actually trying to find out why, if people were not adhering to those guidelines, why they were not adhering. Was it an information and an understanding piece, or were there some other barriers? And in some cases, we realised that there were socioeconomic challenges for people to adhere to, and that was really where we worked very closely with Treasury. And we're pleased to see that, you know, that our advice, our scientific advice, then translated into practical financial support packages for people. And then I think more broadly, as you say, there's disinformation, which is the active telling of the wrong information and, you know, deliberately trying to mislead people in terms of their understanding of the virus. And this is also very important when we get to things like vaccine remedies, and lots of hope that we'll be able to, you know, come back to a more connected and open world because of the advances that we've seen coming so rapidly through our international science collaborations, kind of unprecedented, really. But actually that will all fall to the wayside if people don't trust the science that's been done. So there's lots of things that we've been doing in the UK. Obviously, we have the whole cybersecurity side, and we've been working with our New Zealand collaborators as well on that. And one really nice piece of research that I heard back from the University of Cambridge is actually a game called Go Viral that's being developed by researchers there to try to tackle how people take information, and you can actually play this game. And it actually desensitizes you to that false information. So actually using social psychology and actually the frontiers of knowledge in those research fields to try to design proper practical tools to try to dismantle those disinformation campaigns, which, you know, are pretty virulent, really. I think the Go Viral title is quite an interesting name to use for that in the best possible way. And of course, what I've certainly found in my personal experience is people have a huge appetite for understanding. And if we were able, I'm sure, you know, Juliet's the same, if we were able to go meet every single person in our country and explain what we've been doing in the background and why it matters and how it all works, what we know, and also equally important, what we don't know, what we don't yet know, and what we're doing in order to find out. That honest dialogue, I think, you know, people are very, very open to that. But of course, there's only one each of us, and trying to make sure that we can get that information out in a clear way in such a rapidly changing situation, and in that global context where we connect for good, but also social media and, you know, the internet, the globally connected world on the disinformation side is also quite active. So, you know, there are lots of initiatives, I think, government to government, where we're really working in that piece, keeping an eye on the sorts of data flows that are coming through. Again, some of the graphics, you know, there are various different graphics that again are equally absorbed by people, and then they get the wrong impression, or conspiracy theories that actually the whole virus is a hoax. By the time it hits your family, it's actually too late when you realise it's real. So I think we're making some progress there, but it's a really important piece of work, and again something that we need to connect internationally to if we want to make sure we beat this pandemic.
I think that what we don't know is really important, isn't it?
Yeah.
I had a conversation with my mum, who's in the UK, overnight, and she's debating whether to have the vaccine or not. And the problem seemed to have been caused by the doctor saying it's completely safe.
Yeah, it's the absolutes are not helpful. Yeah, and I think actually people trust you more if you tell them that actually there's the uncertainty. Yeah.
So I said, there's a really, really, really small chance something happens with the vaccine and a really large chance something happens with the disease. So take the vaccine. She's like, oh, why didn't we say that? But it was that admission that there is a risk that was building the trust.
Yeah. I think also the systems, the mechanisms that we use to determine whether something is safe and the risks that go with it. And I know I've had conversations with colleagues and with friends where people will pick up the wrong impression and then they'll say, well, the vaccine. And when you actually explain the vaccine technology, the vaccine landscape, random controlled trials, and why we didn't have a vaccine 4 months ago, actually why you have to go through these different clinical trials and what, the probabilities and the numbers that come out of the papers that we see in the media, what do they actually mean and how did the scientists get to those numbers? I know myself, when I go and read, I need to read the research paper and then I understand the comms that have come from it. So as you say, that information and couching it in the right language builds the trust, and it helps people, I think, make autonomous decisions and make the right decisions for their health rather than be buffeted about by partial messages that might be lost in the telling. So I think you're absolutely right, just explaining the fundamental scientific basis of it.
And that's interesting, isn't it? It's about not making it too black and white, but not making it but getting the right simplicity of message, and it's right. That true. And certainly in this part of the world, it just before Christmas, we had in Samoa the most awful measles outbreak, which was so tragic in terms of the children that died. And that was because in quite a big anti-vax movement following the misadministration of a measles vaccine to two babies. And that, I think, in this part of the world has been a real, I think people really open their eyes and thinking, oh my gosh, quite how dangerous this can be, actually, if you listen to is. But it is going to be, to begin with, of course, that the challenge will be providing enough vaccine for the demand, but then later on we'll get into that territory of those who are more vaccine nervous, presumably. Yeah,
and I think also we have many vaccine preventable diseases, as you say, like measles. So the whole world has been focused on COVID. But of course, if we look at a lot of the developing countries, the low and middle income countries, we have really strong and robust vaccination programs there, which of course have had to go on hold because of the COVID crisis. So supporting countries that have vaccine programs, and the same in our own countries. Let's not forget that, just one generation ago, our parents or our grandparents or our great aunties or whatever would have had the windows open and saying, well, we'll just try to avoid this infectious disease. So we've had a huge, step forward in terms of scientific progress. So we shouldn't throw all that away while we wait for this new vaccine to come. We still have to keep all those programs going. And then, as you say, continue to build the trust and the scientific understanding of this new vaccine, which will be presumably in the future a little bit more like a flu vaccine. We will keep an eye out on seeing whether it's still valid or not, whether it needs to be adapted slightly if there are mutations in the future. But yeah, a permanent part of life and as we go on.
Yeah. And all of that, of course, and none of these challenges sit nicely within one country. They all require international collaboration. So how we work on the science and research and vaccines, how we work on the comms. So can I move us on then to talk a bit more about UK New Zealand science collaboration, and I think that you've both been doing very interesting work on, so Carole on conservation and sustainable use of oceans, Juliet, lots of really important work on plastics and our relationship on plastics. So those are perhaps examples, but it'd be nice to talk about those examples, but then zoom out a little bit and talk about that value of that relationship and science collaboration for the overall bilateral relationship and as it being part of diplomacy.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, maybe I can just touch on some of our oceans work. I know this is, we're both island nations and we rely on our oceans. And I think, we've been very strong and our ministers have been very clear about the oceans as a sustainable resource, biodiversity in the broadest sense. And of course, next year we will be hosting COP26. And so oceans in that bigger sense, that the environmental impact of acidification of the oceans and, some of the wonderful work that, Juliet and her team have been doing, of course, more broadly on plastics. And I think that, we're well aligned in our political views on what we need to do and how we need to bring other countries along in their understanding of what needs to be done, and something quite radical. Actually, we can't just keep relying on our oceans to, absorb all of the atmospheric carbon. I mean, we're seeing some really big changes there. We need something radical, and it's great to see that our Prime Minister has been very strong on the green recovery coming out of COVID. I think never waste a good crisis. This has been a catastrophic pandemic. Great loss of life, but actually we now need to use that to really pivot and focus our minds on some of the radical changes that we need to make. And the science is there, and the engineering is there, and the will is to bring all of that together. And then I think, as you say, in terms of sustainability and biodiversity and resilience and adaptation to climate change and the bigger impacts of those, the oceans are absolutely fundamental there. And I think from the science perspective, I look at other extreme environments, so the ocean seabed. You mentioned the volcano work that Juliet's been involved in. I lead, there's a committee we have in the Commonwealth Office, because Montserrat is one of our overseas territories. That is actually, the island was destroyed, 2/3 of it was destroyed back in 1995. So bringing all the best data to any particular problem that affects our planet and our people. We've got, an incredible network of Earth observation satellites. And so we're able really to monitor our planet from above in a way that we've never been able to before. But also outer space is a resource that we have to think of as a sustainable environment. And so all of those pieces come together, and we really think of our planet as a whole. But science, technology, engineering and innovation sits really at the heart of that. We need to know what's happening so we can, do better if it's not going in the right direction. And how do we actually know what's happening unless we actually measure and take the data and analyse it and then take the right steps? But yeah, I think Juliet's work on the plastics is absolutely fundamental to this.
It's been interesting. Both of the big proactive projects that I've been given by the PM have involved the oceans. So. But in some ways very different in terms of the degree of social license globally to act. So the plastics project was in the sense that there's huge global recognition that we have a problem, perhaps because you can see the plastic. And Laura, you've been involved with the work on Henderson Island, seeing all the plastic that washes up on a beach where nobody's lived for, 1,500 years? So the global connection, absolutely important as we understand how the plastic moves around and have a collective responsibility to clean up one almighty mess that we've made over the last few decades. The other project that we're working on at the moment is about fishing and how to do that in a more data-driven and sustainable way. That's a very different place in the conversation. So whereas in plastic, no matter where in the conversation you were, you acknowledged that we needed to do better. In fishing, we find very polarized views. So some people coming from a conservation lens, completely focused on marine protection areas and all the push for 30 for 30, whereas in the commercial fishing end, more of a focus on innovation, trying to find better tools so you can still fish without damaging the environment, and less absolutist in terms of the tools you might use to solve the problem. So hard to find a way through the marine woods on that one in terms of finding recommendations that everyone can get behind. So I think there's some learnings in there probably about what sort of problems people are prepared to come together to solve.
Yeah.
And I think, Juliet, if I may just interject again, it goes back to your opening comment about community owning problems and finding authentic solutions. And for me, I think it's one of scale. So, what's the role of government when we come with a big policy piece, or we might take it into a multilateral forum and lay a special resolution at the United Nations, for example, as we did recently for the peaceful uses of outer space from the UK, and we had 150 countries align with us and vote for that accord. And then how does that translate, and how does that big policy piece that can produce a big positive shift then manifest itself within different communities, and how do you get that bottom up to connect with the top down, and also to talk the same language? Because actually, as you say, for the commercial fishing side and the 30 by 30, actually the intent is the same and is aligned, but actually the way it translates and impacts those different communities can feel very different. So how do you bring people to the table and say, actually we need to find new language, maybe completely brand new language to help us speak about this common problem? Because ultimately, if we've poisoned our oceans or acidified them to the point where there are no fish living anymore, there'll be no commercial fishing either. And so it's all of that connected piece. And how do we bring science to the lens, I think, to take away some of those more those sensitivities where different communities are clashing in their language, and say, well, actually, let's step back and see what the scientific data tell us, and what do we not have? Again, back to what do we not know? Should we gather some more data and bring more insight to the table, and then you'll be able to see the picture in a broader way, and actually potentially start to see some solutions that work for everybody, or at least the choices that have to be made, the impact of those choices, and how government then can come back and mitigate those.
But that lack of data in the ocean is just such a huge challenge.
Yeah.
And you find that people hide behind the fact we don't know to not act on all sides of the debate. So it's like, how do you make those really crucial, quite urgent in some cases, decisions when there's very little data in some of the areas of the ocean that you really need to know about?
Absolutely.
We've been trying to find a simple catch-all phrase. So for the Rethink Plastics project, we ended up with make best practice standard practice, because that was a way of promulgating actions that everyone could get behind. For the current project, so far we've got, it's quite dark down there because just to reflect the lack of data and the fact that we need it, but I'm not sure that's going to catch on.
Yeah, the ocean's a big place. It's both in terms of surface area and, as you say, even in depth, because some parts of the ocean, it is pretty dark down there. Yeah, and I think also sharing data. So, how do you define the next systems that we need? We have, as I say, we have lots of Earth observation satellites. They're all doing all sorts of different things. And how do we make the downstream products? So if we do have raw data, how do we make sure that we're extracting the right information from it and asking the right questions? Yeah, really interesting.
And I'm struck that so much of this is about the science and understanding the science and communicating that science and data. But the result that we needs to be widespread public understanding and behavior change. And, I think what's interesting is when you have something like a global pandemic, where it really gets the adrenaline, it gets that sort of fight or flight response going, people are more prepared to make drastic behavioral change or business change to tackle it. Similarly, if you have conflict or you have, something really major that's right in your face, it's sort of in a way simpler than when you have issues like looking after our ocean or tackling climate change, because those things, even though they are happening at quite a pace and are existential, they don't get that same fight or flight adrenalized response going, and that's in a way part of the challenge, isn't it? You've got the science, you've got the communications, and then you've got the desired behavioral change across all these things.
Yeah, absolutely. They always say that every great disaster movie starts with a scientist being ignored. But I think Dame Sally Davis's analogy really struck me. I heard her say this a few weeks ago about the difference between the COVID crisis and antimicrobial resistance globally, and this is something she's championed for a number of years. And she likens it to the lobster in the pot. So she said COVID is like a boiling pot of water that reaches 100 degrees Celsius, and you throw the lobster and it squeals and it leaps out, versus AMR or climate change or all of the other things we've talked about today. You put the pot and you put a pot of cold water, you put the lobster in and you slowly bring it to the boil, and we're the lobster. And our planet is the lobster. And so you're absolutely right. We're not conditioned to actually deal with fight or flight in that sustained way. So I think that's where the role of CSAs, communicating with our academic research communities, who may already have that evidence and may not be, equipped to communicate it in a way that will add agency. And we sit almost in a translation point. I think Juliet's made this point beautifully about the communications. There's communications with the public. There's also communications with our ministers. And then how do you support action, because then how you operationalize the action that you need to take, and how you do that in an international context where different countries might be thinking about problems or not even thinking about problems in a different way. How do you then get that momentum going and keep it going? I think is a fundamental problem. I think and taking some learning from COVID will be valuable, but I know that we're all quite tired. And I hear people saying, I want to go back to normal. And then I hear communities, particularly, minority groups who have been particularly disadvantaged, saying, I don't want to go back to normal. I want there to be fundamental change. We can't go back to the way it was before.
Thank you. Now I'm conscious of time, but I'll just pick up very briefly on antimicrobial resistance being one of the things that I worry about, that we're not worrying about enough. But that is also a real issue, and we could go off and talk about that. But I really want to come, if I can, to the questions that we've had through from the chat. And I want to start, if I can, with one question from one of our audience, which is, what is the greatest impact you both feel that you've had in your respective roles?
Wow, I'm gonna let Juliet speak first. That's a really big question. That's fantastic.
I'm not sure. I think that's an ask me in 10 years question, really. It's all the work that we've done, I'm so close to at the moment, and whether it has an impact or not, I don't know. So the plastic report, most of the recommendations got accepted and they'll be rolled out, but whether that has an impact, we won't really know until the rollout piece has been done. How's that for ducking the question? You try, Carole.
Yeah, I agree. No, I was asked this recently, actually, and I suppose I felt, go ask somebody else about my impact. I think it's the broader networks that we work in. I mean, every little step that we take, every conversation that we have that we wouldn't otherwise have had, I think that adds up. And I think I have to believe that that adds up. And we look at the world and we see the progress that we have made over a generation, and even the progress that we've made in 6 months. So for me, it's those people-to-people connections. It's keeping those conversations open. It's not closing in on ourselves. You know, sometimes you might feel like never getting out of bed because the world is a scary place. I mean, as an astrophysicist, the universe is a big, empty, black, scary, violent place. You know, it's out there. We've got black holes forming. We've got, you know, lots of violence out there. And I guess we're this tiny little planet. And I think it was the writer Ray Bradbury who said, he was once asked when he was elderly, "Are you afraid of death?" And he said, "Hell no, I'm going to enjoy the ride for as long as it lasts." And actually, when you think about a universe that's nearly 14 billion years old, and we've been lent out as sentient beings for that short period of time, we're going to make the most of it. So I think, you know, these sorts of conversations are wonderful, connecting and just trying to make a tiny difference each day. You know, if everybody did that, think about the impact we would all have on the world.
Gosh, and that sense of scale and perspective is really something, isn't it? To make us all pause and reflect and feel very, very small. And I think that's really interesting, because in a way, sometimes, you know, when you have the political cycles of 3 years in New Zealand, 5 years in the UK, you know, there's that sometimes generates a slightly more short-termist thinking, but it's these sorts of relationships and the science collaboration that I think can be really important in terms of enduring relationships and also progress. But it can take a long time, can't it? You know, and we all have to be in this for the long game and laying the foundations, building the relationships, and then also bringing on the next generation, which brings me rather neatly to my next question, which is from another of our audience. What advice would you give to women at the beginning and middle parts of their careers to support them achieve their full potential? So if you, or maybe let me sort of reframe that. If you were talking to your 30-year-old self, what advice would you give yourself now with the benefit of hindsight?
I would say connect. Networks, connections, and those support structures, both within your immediate environment, but if you can, nationally and internationally, gives you a great support structure, I think, when things go wrong or you're feeling under pressure. I think it also gives you a great sanity check and gives you perspective. I think I would always also tell my 30-year-old self to relax and say, actually, opportunities come along and you find yourself in a role, like a CSA role, that you could never, ever predict. You know, I didn't say as a little girl, I want to grow up to be a chief scientific advisor. Take opportunities when they come and actually have the courage to try something a bit different. You never know what it'll lead to or what skill it will give you that you'll then be able to deploy in a completely unexpected way. But for me, again, it's those connections and those networks.
Yeah, I think I'd tell myself to do what gave me energy and gave me joy. So I think there's a tendency to get sent down a chute. And so in my case, people were always saying you should focus more. But actually, my utter lack of ability to focus and dabble in a broad range of things set me up perfectly for this job. So rather than do what's the approved pathway, just see what gives you energy and follow that and seize opportunities. And people also say no, learn how to say no, but learning how to say yes is quite good too. Say yes to the right things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And there's something, isn't there, about sort of obviously being very focused, but not taking things too seriously, I think, in a way. And just, yeah, absolutely. I'm going to just call on Caitlin, because I've seen a couple of questions flash up, but I'm don't seem to be capable of looking at them on my screen. So can I ask you, Caitlin, as you're sort of organising us, to just here we are. I've just seen them. I've managed to make it work. So I've got a couple more. Rebecca asks, extending the lobster metaphor, how can we fight the slow continual misinformation and disinformation across the board, which feels like another slow building pandemic? So that's coming back to misinformation. I'm going to do this other question as well, and then you can sort of pick and choose or tackle them together. Jack Jones, who is a UK fast stream scientist, says, what is one future scientific challenge in government that we should prepare ourselves for? So you need your crystal balls.
I'll say the next pandemic. I mean, Juliet, I don't know if you want to pick up on the misinformation, disinformation. I agree. I mean, the anti-science, anti-evidence, that is something we have to tackle, but we have to do that with the humility of our expertise and within our systems, I think, and also continue to look back. Any academic colleagues who are on the call will think about peer review and think about the quality of the journals they publish in, and always having that humility and thinking, why am I doing what I'm doing? We can sometimes be pushed under pressures. We want to win a grant, we want to show our boss that we're doing well, and we actually have to go back and really understand the fundamental importance of the integrity of the science that we do, and how that then gets used and springboarded into government, and how we use that for our international connections. So I think, giving our academic communities the confidence to do the right thing and to lead with integrity, and then to be valued for that, I think is one important part of that.
Yeah, I think I'd pick the misinformation, disinformation, and the difference between the two as one of the big challenges for government, actually. And there's something around the way science has evolved to be quite persuasive. So I think the grant culture, the fact that everybody's introduction in the paper is pushing a particular point of view and then building up a story about how the evidence is going to back that. There's something about stepping back and being a bit more honest about serendipity, and being a bit more honest about what we do know and what we don't know, and being a bit more honest about this idea being an idea that we're going to test and we might be wrong. I think we need to lead the way in terms of that honesty, and not get pigeonholed in one camp or the other camp that's going to get magnified on social media. So just a culture of how we communicate, especially publicly, uncertainty and testing knowledge, and how we learn.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I suppose that what goes with that also is an organizational culture that is comfortable with risk, because otherwise, unless you have that, of course, nothing works, does it? We'll just sort of sit in the same place and not get anywhere.
Yeah.
Question now from is it Kynan? Sorry about if I got that wrong. Kynan Williams. He is working on promoting diversity and inclusion, and working on the role of women in the British Army, but says that as a white man he often feels a guilt by association in his role. So how can he move past this mental barrier? So it's a nice question about sort of being an ally, I think.
I think male allies can't be, or any allies can't be, overstated the importance of the role. And I think I've been often asked this, and I sort of, speak to colleagues in other minorities as well, and I sit with a certain privilege. As a colleague I spoke to recently, and he said, I'm an Asian man, so when I'm in a room and the power dynamic is gender, then I'm in the privilege set. When I'm in a room of white people, I'm in the disadvantage set. And so one person can flip from being in the power to being out of the power group. So I think, agency and allies are really important, and everything just from speaking up in a room when you see something that happens that's not right, the sort of bystander intervention can be fundamentally important. Seeing who the minority or the disadvantaged person is in the room and amplifying their voice can be really important, and knowing that you have the agency to make a change and be that change. And I think, just to say we see you and thank you, and don't worry about the guilt, just go on and do some great stuff.
And to create the spaces for those people. So there's that fine line between backing up a point and amplifying the point and appropriating the point. So
absolutely,
so, commending a point and saying, would you elaborate, is so much stronger than saying, I agree with that, and reinterpreting it in your own frame.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And just being conscious of those dynamics, I think, in all interactions, because they are there essentially in all interactions, and we just need to have our eye being sharp to pick up on those things. Now, I can't see that I've got more. Here we are, one last question, which I think we can just about fit in, if that's okay. Sorry, here we are, building on the conversation on oceans and plastics, and the difference we need to make to our behaviors. How important do you think it is for us to put value on nature? There we go, tackle that in 2 minutes, professors. Value on nature, critical, of course.
Total cost of ownership. Yes, I agree. And all I can say is it's our younger generation that have made us have the courage to really put climate at the heart, you know. And I was in Whitehall when our young people were coming down with their demonstrations and their climate emergency banners, and, you know, hugely game changing. And, you know, they're holding our generation to account. You know, we need to have the courage. We know the problems there. We need to mobilise ourselves. And you're right, actually putting that monetary value and saying this is the total cost of ownership of the thing that you have in your hand or the behaviour that you have now, making it visible, I think, is really powerful.
Yeah, or devaluing the value of money, I suppose. I mean, it's like reinterpreting what value means, isn't it? So yes. It's not just financial, it's also all the environmental piece and the social piece and the social cohesion. And yeah, all those the school kids marching for climate certainly gave me the tingles. I hope they'll be back as soon as we get marching again.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's that conceptual shift on how we value things, and therefore how we behave and what decisions we make as businesses, individuals, governments, investors. That's critical. Well, listen, kia ora koroa, thank you so much, both of you, for a really wonderful conversation. I've very much enjoyed it. I've just been able to sort of sit back and listen to you both. It's been great, and I'm sure our audience have very much enjoyed it too. So on behalf of all of us online, Namihi nui kia koroa, thank you very much. Very, very big appreciation from everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day for those of you on this side of the world, and enjoy the rest of your evening for friends and colleagues in the UK. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Juliet.
Kia ora, thanks, Carole.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Laura.
Bye.
Bye-bye.